From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Noisy and violent ghosts. Included in this category are ghostly phenomena of a poltergeist character. One such case occurred in 1879 in North Lincolnshire. Mr. Edward Solby, a man of independent means, occupied a cottage in the village of Butesford, which is a few miles from Scunthorpe. Mr. Solby informed his nearest neighbour one day that he believed he was bewitched. He told him that one Sunday, when it was fine and there was very little wind, he had seen the branches of a tree which grew very near the cottage suddenly sway violently to and fro and deliberately crash against the window. It broke the glass to pieces. He said that soon after this had happened, he saw the tea kettle bounce from the fire onto the kitchen floor and trot across the road. When it reached the far side of the road, it trotted back into the cottage, resumed its position on the fire, and recommenced singing. On another occasion he encountered a can of water on the staircase. It disputed the right of way with him step by step until he reached the landing, when it let him proceed without further interference. More alarming things occurred. A heavy case containing lard came rattling down the stairs one day and broke one of the steps. Some of the flagstones that paved the floor of the cottage at once rose, seemingly of their own accord, and hurled themselves through a window onto the road. The only other occupant of the cottage when these uncanny things occurred was Mr. Solby's granddaughter, Betsy Solby, a girl well advanced in her teens, who lived with him. Solby declared that an evil spirit was responsible for all the strange and destructive happenings. He made Betsy and the domestic animals, including the pigs, wear garlands of wicker branches round their backs, hoping that this would be a means of getting rid of the spirit. Mr. Peacock, a magistrate who resided in a neighbouring village, advised Mr. Solby to send Betsy away. Mr. Solby did as he suggested, and after Betsy had left the cottage, there were no more disturbances. This leads one to suppose that Betsy was in some way responsible for the disturbances. Possibly she had a peculiar attraction for a certain species of spirits, or there was in her a force or element which at times she was unable to control, and which had to find a field for its pent-up activity. The following rather more unusual case of noisy and violent ghost happenings is taken from an old manuscript of the 17th century. In 1679, the house of Mr. William Merce of Newbury, Berkshire, was infested with demons. A long staff danced up and down in the chimney, and was afterwards hung upon a line and swung to and fro. An iron crook was hurled about by an invisible hand. A chair flew about a room and alighted on a table. A chest was carried from one place to another. A door was barricaded, and the keys of the house were taken off the bunch and flung about, making a loud noise. A little boy was the chief sufferer. He was flung about with such violence that his friends feared his brains would be dashed out. His bedclothes were pulled off his bed, and his bed was shaken. A man who tried to hold him down in a chair. His efforts, however, were in vain, for the boy was raised constantly up and then thrust forcibly down, while the chair kept moving about the room, apparently of its own accord. When the chair finally became stationary, the boy was taken out of it by an invisible agency and thrown across the floor to within a few feet of the fire. He was pricked on the back, and knives were struck to him. The spectators pulled the knives out of his body, which was unharmed. Sometimes he barked like a dog, and sometimes clucked like a hen. It was after this extraordinary behaviour on his part that the apparition of a black boy was seen, not only individually but collectively. The advent of the spectre was accompanied by violent drumming and thumping on a table. After these demonstrations, a ghostly voice exclaimed, "Revenge, sweet revenge." The listeners besought God to protect them against the evil spirits present, whereupon the same ghostly voice cried, Alas, alas, we are cast out. We knock and demonstrate no more. After that, the phenomenal disturbances in the house ceased. Provided the case is in the main true, it is of peculiar interest, inasmuch as it proves that spirits are sometimes, at any rate, definitely present during disturbances of a poltergeist character, and very probably are the sole cause of them. It certainly seemed so in a case of noisy and dangerous happenings in 1852 in Blackley. In the autumn of that year, the landlord of the popular village inn was a clogger named William Whitehead. He had been living quite peacefully in the house for fully 10 months before anything disturbing occurred. According to his statements, he was on the ground floor of the house one day, probably in the tap room, when he heard a sound like the whistling of a railway engine. He went into a back room from which the sound seemed to come, and heard a loud cackling. He searched the room without discovering any hen in it. He trod on a certain flagstone, and immediately there were terrific screams, which ceased directly he stepped off the stone. Other members of the family, who came running to the room on hearing the screaming, trod on the stone, and the same thing happened. He removed the flagstone, and after digging for some time, found a large jar filled with lime and bones. A village conference was held, and several people who examined the bones believed that they were the bones of a human being who had been murdered in the house many years ago. The disturbances continued and became more and more incessant. The most harrowing screaming and hoarse cackling was heard every night in the week and sometimes during the day. Some of the oldest inhabitants of Blackley declared that the ghost of Mrs. Shaw, who had formerly lived in the old hall which stood near the inn, was the cause of the disturbances. Other people said that the haunting was due to the depravity of certain persons in the village, who spent too much of their time in the inn. An old man named George Horrock, who once lived in the inn, said that on 2 occasions he saw the ghost, which is in the form of a young woman, and made noises like the rumbling of stones. Many people visited the house, and efforts to lay the ghost proved of no avail. It sometimes did dangerous things. On one occasion it lifted a kettle full of boiling water from the kitchen fire and set it on the floor, in a place where people were most likely to fall over it. The inn was known to have been haunted for at least 85 years. Whether the Whiteheads remained in it or were forced to leave owing to the disturbances, I have not been able to ascertain. There was no further reference to it in the local press. Another haunting, which was of a violent description but hardly comes within the category of poltergeist phenomena, is mentioned in All the Year Round. In the year 1868, Mr. Ronaldson read in a newspaper that there was a furnished house to let about 10 miles from London. He applied at once for permission to view it. It was a picturesque old building, with extensive wooded grounds occupying an isolated and lonely position. He was charmed with its appearance, situation, and interior, especially with one large bedroom. He decided to rent the house, and having signed an agreement and made all the necessary arrangements, he took up his abode there. He engaged the woman who had been acting as caretaker as his housekeeper. She begged him not to sleep in the room that he had liked so much. She told him that it was damp, and that the bed linen had not been sufficiently aired. She suggested that he should sleep at an inn in the nearest village until she had got another bedroom ready for him. The objections she raised to his sleeping in the large room roused his suspicions, and made him all the more determined to occupy it. Eventually she gave way. After he had her supper, which she had prepared for him, he strolled about the grounds for a short time. When he returned to the house, he found the housekeeper lighting a number of candles in his bedroom. He told her that he did not want so many candles, that it was quite an unnecessary expenditure. She appeared to be greatly concerned, and implored him to keep them burning all night. He promised that he would do so in order to appease her, but directly she had left the room he extinguished all the candles except one, and he blew that one out as soon as he was in bed. Try how he would, he could not go to sleep. In spite of the woman's warnings, the bed felt warm and comfortable. He was tired after his journey, and yet something kept him awake. He resorted to various devices to make him drowsy, but it was all to no purpose. He just could not sleep. Suddenly, much to his surprise, he heard murmuring. He strained his ears and listened. It was no fancy. There were voices. They ceased to murmur and developed into the gruff voices of men engaged in a violent quarrel. There were many oaths and much foul language. Ronaldson got up and lit a candle. The voices at once ceased, and there was absolute silence. Considerably shocked and mystified, and not a little frightened, Ronaldson got back into bed and blew out the candle. The voices began again at once, and were accompanied by tramping and scurrying of feet, heavy breathing and gasping, and sounds of savage blows. A desperate fight was seemingly in progress in Ronaldson's room. The imprecations used suggested that it was the reenaction of a fight to the death, which had taken place very many years ago. The cries and groans that succeeded the sounds of struggling were of the most appalling description. Ronaldson was shocked into a state of unconsciousness. When he recovered, everywhere was still, and the dawn was breaking. As a result of his harrowing experience during the night, he had brain fever and lay between life and death for many weeks. He recovered eventually and made exhaustive inquiries regarding the haunting. He was unsuccessful. The housekeeper and the agent for the property either could not or would not tell him anything, and he fared the same with everyone whom he questioned. Christmas and noisy ghosts. Some years ago, Badenoch, near Blair Athol, harbored more than one ghost. A Badenoch woman married a Bonskede man and went to that place to live with him. She brought with her servants who were also natives of Badenoch, and neither she or they brought with them one or more of the Badenoch ghosts, for soon after they came to the house at Bonskede supernatural disturbances commenced. Turnips were thrown about the kitchen by invisible hands, candles were mysteriously blown out. A spinning wheel was seen to come downstairs and fall to pieces in a room on the ground floor. No sooner was it put together than it walked upstairs impelled by no visible hands, and then came down again and fell to pieces as before. The owner of the house was standing in a room with a lighted candle in his hand when a potato was thrown at him. It hit him and extinguished the candle. He heard one of the servants laughing at him, and sent her and the other servants who had accompanied his wife back to Badenoch, and there were no more disturbances. The road from the wood of Nant to Kilcrenan to Loch Weeside was haunted not very long ago by a black shadow. People who walked along the road on a fine moonlit night saw two shadows moving alongside them. One of the shadows resembled one of them. The other shadow was that of a queer little man with a very big head and a hump on his back. He was called Bodak Big Chilishevnan. Phantom cats would seem to be more plentiful in Scotland than in other countries. A loch in the north of Tiree was haunted by a swarm of howling cats, and some years ago several houses in Dundee and Aberdeen were rumoured to be troubled at times by ghost cats that had the unpleasant habit of jumping on beds at night. I've heard of more than one alleged haunting in Inverary. The fishermen there were troubled at one time by a ghost that interfered with their nets, and a place near Appin was haunted by a ghost with arms like bags of wool that on one occasion was seen to attack a man. One of the worst reputed haunted outdoor places in Scotland is in Skye. Horrible forms are seen, and sounds of gurgling and throttling are heard on a lonely road in the vicinity of Portree. It takes a very brave man to go along that road alone at night. Most people avoid it even in the twilight. There is a superstition still extant in the west of Scotland that if you wish to see the person who is destined to figure prominently in your life within the next 12 months, you have only to peer through the window of the dining room of your house at midnight on Christmas Eve, and you will see, standing behind the chair on which you are accustomed to sit, the shadowy figure of such an individual. Relative to this superstition there is the following story. Two people from Glasgow were spending Christmas week in a quaint old hotel near Loch Fyne. Desirous of putting the superstition to the test, they stole quietly out of the hotel at midnight and peered through the window of the dining room, which was dark and deserted. Nothing happening, they were about to come away disappointed when the door of the dining room suddenly opened and a tall man, dressed according to the mode prevalent about the middle of the 18th century, entered carrying a lighted candle in one hand and in the other a pistol. Placing the pistol on the long table in the center of the room, he examined it closely, and then, raising it to his head, he pulled the trigger. There was a loud report, a blinding flash, and the room was plunged into darkness. The man and the candle vanished. Badly scared, the two visitors ran into the hotel expecting to find its inmates alarmed and probably panic-stricken. To their great surprise, however, no one was astir and the house was wrapped in silence. They saw the night porter and told him what had happened. He said that he had not heard any sound and persisted that they must have imagined that they had seen a man shoot himself, that there was no such man in the hotel. In the morning they sought the landlord and told him what they had witnessed. He was rude at first, but when they threatened to leave the hotel, at once he became apologetic, and informed them that the hotel had been haunted for a long time by the ghost of a gentleman who was believed to have committed suicide in the dining room one Christmas Eve about the middle of the 18th century. He said that the ghost only appeared on the anniversary of the suicide, and that only the people who actually saw it heard the report of the shot. He begged the two visitors not to tell the other guests, as should they tell him, it might injure his business. The two visitors promised not to say a word, but their nerves were so badly shaken that they left the hotel the following day. The ford of Athladair near Loch Matty in North Uist has long been reputed to be haunted, chiefly on Halloween and Christmas. Gruesome lights and terrifying forms, bearing no resemblance to anything of this world, are seen there. Another Christmas haunting is at a crossroad north of Argyll. A party of revelers were driving by the crossroad on Christmas Eve when their horses shied, and they saw lying on the ground a very tall woman with a white shawl wrapped around her head. Really alarmed, they got out of the carriage, only to discover, to their astonishment, that the woman had vanished and was not to be seen anywhere. When they told the people with whom they were spending Christmas about the strange experience, they were informed that the crossroad was well known to be haunted by the ghost of Brown Maggie, a woman who had murdered an old man in a particularly cruel manner, and had been gibbeted at the crossroad in the 18th or early 19th century. The vengeance of ghosts. Intense hatred is not infrequently the reason for the very violent haunting of an individual or family. An instance of extreme hatred and the desire for vengeance generating the haunting of a family is given in Ghostly Visitors. The M's, a Scottish family renowned for their generosity and hospitality, lived for many years in a mansion on a rocky promontory of one of the Western Isles. Miss D was a guest at the mansion when a ball of exceptional splendor was given to celebrate an honor that had been bestowed upon a member of the M family. Miss D had for a partner in one of the dances the second son of the laird of the estate, a young naval officer. After the dance she was walking in the hall with him when she was surprised and horrified to see a girl, whom she took to be Maria H., one of the guests, gazing in at her through what appeared to be an inaccessible window. "What a foolish girl!" she exclaimed. "She will fall and be killed if she does not take care." As she drew nearer to the window, it being a light morning, the dawn had broken, she saw that it was not Maria, but a young and very lovely girl dressed in white, with long hair falling over her shoulders. On her right arm she wore a broad silver bracelet of peculiar design. She stared fixedly at Miss D for some seconds and then disappeared. "Good heavens! She has fallen!" Miss D cried. She ran to the window and peered out of it. The window overlooked steep, precipitous rocks bordering the sea. There was no sign of the pretty girl. Miss D and her partner walked back to the ballroom. He was very silent. They met Maria just leaving the room. She had never been outside the house. Miss D asked her partner who the girl at the window could have been. "Don't mention what you have seen to any of my family," he replied. "I will tell you who I think it was. But first let me ask if you observed a bracelet on the girl's arm." "Yes," said Miss D. "I did notice one," and then described it. He became pale and said, "You have seen the evil genius of our house. Her history is this. One of my ancestors fell in love with a beautiful girl of humble birth. They became engaged and were about to be married when the girl suddenly disappeared and was never seen or heard of again. It was supposed that she had been murdered by a relative of my ancestor, who strongly disapproved of the marriage. From time immemorial there had been preserved in our family 2 silver bracelets, such as you describe, with which our chiefs betrothed their brides. It was believed that my ancestor had given one of the bracelets to the girl he intended to marry. Ever since she vanished, her ghost has always appeared, wearing the silver bracelet, prior to the death of a member of my family. Her advent on this occasion prognosticated his own death, which occurred within a short time of her appearance at the hall window. James Grant, in his book The Mysteries of All Nations, relates the traditional Italian ghost story of the haunting of a murderer by his victim. Carlo Stella, a handsome, unscrupulous, predatory young Italian of low extraction, chanced one day to render service to the gay and fashionable Baron Cataneo. Learning that the Baron was reputed to be very wealthy, Stella lost no time in ingratiating himself with Cataneo and cultivating his friendship. Night after night he induced the Baron to drink heavily and play cards with him for ever increasing stakes, and finally got him to stake everything he possessed. Stella won. He always won. He took care to get the Baron's signature to a documentary conveyance while Cataneo was still under the influence of drink. The following day the Baron was found dead, shot through the head. Stella, by virtue of the deed of conveyance, acquired all the Baron's land and money. He was suspected of murdering the Baron, but as nothing definite was proved against him, he escaped arrest. He soon afterwards became engaged to the beautiful widow of an Italian nobleman. At the hour appointed for their marriage, when the bridal party were all seated in the church, a tall, heavily cloaked man with a ghastly wound in his face strode noiselessly up the central aisle, stood for a few moments gazing sternly at Stella, who fainted, and then as silently left the building. Whither he went no one knew. The marriage was postponed until the following evening. Once again the bridal party assembled in the church, and the service was about to commence, when the same tall, blood-stained man entered the building. This time he strode right up to Stella, who regarded him with horror and whispered in his ear. He then turned down one of the side aisles and mysteriously disappeared. Stella again fainted. The bride and everyone who had come to witness the ceremony were terrified and hurriedly left the church. The next day the widow broke off her engagement to Stella. He was awakened every night by unearthly ghastly sounds in his room, and was horribly conscious of something very dreadful bending menacingly over him. He was tormented to such a degree that he besought a woman who lived in a cottage near his estate, and was reputed to be a seer, and to be able to conjure up spirits at will, to do her utmost to rid him of the evil spirit that was haunting him. She promised to do her best, took the money he gave her, spat on it, put it in a weasel skin purse, and then into her pocket. Muttering what Stella supposed was an incantation appropriate for the occasion, she threw some powder out of a black oak box into the fire. Presently a tall, cylindrical blue light rose from the floor in front of Stella, and a voice apparently proceeding from it exclaimed, "Murderer, you will be freed from me for 2 days. On the 3rd day from now we shall meet again." Directly these ominous words had been pronounced, the light vanished. The extreme eeriness of the visual and auditory phenomena appalled Stella. He fully believed that they were supernatural and due to the presence in the room of the murdered Baron. Greatly perturbed, he left the cottage and returned home. He kept a light burning in his room all night, and had 2 armed servants stationed on the landing outside his room, with strict injunctions to come to him at once should he summon them. About noon on the 3rd day after his visit to the reputed seer, 2 of his acquaintances, who were on the bank of the river adjoining the estate, saw him careering wildly towards them on his favorite black horse. As he drew nearer, they perceived that his face was convulsed with terror. They moved quickly to one side as he dashed by them, and plunged over the steep bank into the river. They saw nothing to account for his extreme horror, but they distinctly felt something accompanied by a cold current of air, which passed them as if in hot pursuit of him. For some moments they were too frightened to do anything, and when they had recovered sufficiently to scramble down the steep bank and peer into the deep, swift-flowing river, they saw no sign of Stella or his horse. His body was not recovered for some days. Many people who believed that he had murdered Baron Cataneo, and that he was guilty of other crimes too, attributed his tragic end to supernatural agency. Haunted graves and coffins. The following circumstances of intense hatred of a person being a probable cause of a violent haunting derives its authenticity from an 18th century manuscript. About the middle of the 18th century, there was living alone at an old country haunt, Lincolnshire, an elderly squire. The house, which had once been full of life and gaiety, had become the abode of gloom and sadness owing to the death of the squire's wife and daughter, who was sole heiress of all his possessions. The bodies of the lady and her daughter were deposited in the family vault amid the lamentation of the squire, who was heartbroken, and of the villagers by whom the deceased ladies were highly esteemed. For some years the squire's only brother had lived at the Hall. He had left it on account of the animosity that he had manifested towards the squire's wife, who reciprocated his sentiment, but in a less blatantly aggressive manner. Because of the feud that existed between the two persons, the squire had had no intercourse whatsoever with his brother after the latter had left the Hall. Some months after the deaths of the squire's wife and daughter, the rector of the village, who had been a great friend of the family for many years, contrived to bring about a reconciliation between the squire and his brother, with the result that the latter returned to the Hall. One condition was made, namely that there should never be any allusion to the deceased sister-in-law. A year after the reconciliation had taken place between the two men, a malignant fever broke out in the village. Among its victims was the squire's brother. Shortly before he died, the rector begged him to forgive his sister-in-law for anything that she may have done to offend or harm him. His efforts were fruitless. His prayers only incensed the dying man, who sat up in bed and exclaimed, "I know that I am dying. If, when I am dead, you dare to bury me in the family vault with that accursed woman, the living as well as the dead shall hear of me." He fell back with a frightful imprecation on his lips and expired. The rector was immeasurably shocked. He did not suppose for one moment that the dying man could carry out his threat, and he deemed it wise to make no allusion to it either to the squire or to anyone else. The body of the dead man, after lying in state for several days, was consigned to the family vault in the churchyard, and placed next to the coffin of the squire's wife and daughter. That night the villagers living near the church were alarmed by fearful shrieks and cries coming from the churchyard. It seemed as though a desperate struggle was taking place between two or more people. The rector, to whom the extraordinary occurrence in the night was reported, told the squire about his brother's dying threat, and suggested the immediate opening of the vault. When this was done, an astounding spectacle was disclosed. The coffin of the squire's wife and daughter were lying in a far corner of the vault, the girl's coffin across the coffin of her mother, as if to protect it. Close to them, standing, not as deposited, but erect and menacing, was the coffin of the squire's brother, which had so recently and decorously been placed upon black trestles. The coffins were restored to their original places, and the vault was again closed. That night the noises in the vault were even louder than previously. The sounds of blows and shrieks of pain and terror appalled the villagers, who were keeping watch on the churchyard to prevent the possibility of tricksters. The nocturnal disturbances continued with unabated frightfulness until the squire, at the advice of one of his friends, had a strong brick wall made in the vault to separate the coffins of his wife and daughter from the coffin of his brother. This had the desired effect. The noises ceased, and the coffins remained undisturbed. Another case of ghostly disturbance in a churchyard is related in the same book. A youth named Robert Batty expressed a wish more than once that he should be buried within the church of Arthurette in the north of England, in which for several generations members of his mother's family, the Grahams of Grahamshill, had been interred. He was accidentally drowned on August 12, 1680, with little more than 23 years of age. Unexpected circumstances prevented his nearest kinsfolk obeying his injunctions relative to the burial place of his body. It was interred without and not within Arthurette Church. On the night after his funeral, his ghost appeared to his youngest sister Mary, and upbraided her for not having regarded his wishes. She was not at all frightened, and calmly told the apparition that the place of burial had not been chosen by her but by other people. The ghost threatened to molest the people who had disregarded his wishes until they had his body removed and put in the church. Mary assured him that she would do all she could in the matter. The following morning some agricultural laborers who were passing through the churchyard on their way to work found Batty's grave disturbed. All the earth which covered the coffin had been thrown out, and the coffin was exposed to their view. They informed the rector. He had the grave filled in and employed people to keep watch in the churchyard. The watching, however, was of no avail. On 2 succeeding nights, the earth was thrown out of the grave and the coffin again exposed to view. Mary, who was much alarmed at these occurrences, implored her kinfolk to do everything in their power with regard to the fulfillment of her brother's wishes. A faculty was obtained from York, where the Archbishop's court was held, authorizing the removal of Batty's body to the family vault within the church. Soon after this was done, the ghost of Robert Batty appeared again to Mary and informed her that it was now at rest, and that there would be no more alarming occurrences.